On April 11, 2026, Pakistan deployed approximately 13,000 ground troops and at least 10 fighter jets to King Abdulaziz Air Base in Saudi Arabia's eastern province. And most Americans have no idea this happened, but they should, because this single military move just rewired the entire geopolitical architecture of the Middle East. That base sits 7 kilometers from Aramco's headquarters, 40 kilometers from the Ras Tanura oil terminal, and 60 kilometers from the Abqaiq processing facility, the arteries of the global oil economy. Pakistan didn't just send soldiers. It parked a nuclear-capable military force right on top of the world's most critical energy infrastructure. This is the first formal military pact between an Arab Gulf state and a nuclear power. Read that again. And even though the immediate catalyst appeared to be Israeli strikes on Qatar, it was always clear that this agreement was directed at Iran. The SMDA was signed just 8 days after Israel's assassination of Hamas leadership in Doha, an event that shattered American security credibility across the entire Gulf and created the political space for Saudi Arabia to seek an alternative defense guarantor. MBS looked at Washington, decided the guarantee was hollow, and called Islamabad instead. This isn't just a troop deployment. This is Saudi Arabia firing a warning shot at the American security umbrella, and the world just changed because of it. Let me take you back to September 17th, 2025, because that's where this story really begins. And if you don't understand what happened in that palace in Riyadh on that day, you cannot understand what is unfolding right now in front of your eyes. 2 men sat across from each other inside Al Yamama Palace. On one side was Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. On the other side was Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. Standing beside him was Pakistan's Army Chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir. The document they signed was called the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, and its core clause was just 12 words long. Any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. 12 words. That's all it took to reshape the entire security architecture of the Middle East. Now, I want you to understand why this happened when it did, because in geopolitics, timing is everything. The 2 countries' decision to publicize the pact stems predominantly from the Israeli attack in Doha, Qatar. Qatar had been serving as a mediator between Israel and Hamas. In September 2025, Israel targeted a Hamas delegation in Doha. That attack startled and frightened Gulf states, whose leaders believed that their close partnerships with the United States would deter Israel from conducting operations on their soil. Think about that for a second. The Gulf states had spent decades building their relationship with Washington under one core assumption, that the American umbrella would protect them. And then Israel struck Qatar's capital while Qatar was doing America's diplomatic work. The umbrella didn't open. MBS watched all of this, and he drew his conclusion. The pact with Pakistan had long remained a fallback option, pursued quietly in the background, while Riyadh continued its primary effort to secure a broad mutual defense treaty with Washington. But the comprehensive defense ties Riyadh wished for did not materialize. So MBS did what any shrewd leader does when his primary option fails. He exercised his backup plan. And his backup plan was Pakistan, not France, not Britain, not some other NATO ally. Pakistan, the only Muslim-majority nuclear power on Earth. And that choice is not accidental, it is not symbolic, it is deeply strategic, and it carries implications that Washington still doesn't want to fully admit to itself. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a surprise joint attack on Iran. They killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The Middle East had not seen a moment like this since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered World War I. In Saudi Arabia, air defense systems went into overdrive as Iranian ballistic missiles screamed toward Riyadh. Now, the SMDA wasn't a diplomatic document anymore. It was a live wire. It was either going to mean something or it wasn't. And the entire world, Tehran, Washington, Beijing, New Delhi, I was watching to see which one it would be. On March 3rd, 2026, Pakistani Foreign Minister Mohammad Ishaq Dar walked up to a microphone and said something that sent shockwaves through every capital from Washington to Beijing. He said he had personally warned Tehran not to strike Saudi Arabia. Now think carefully about what that means. Pakistan, a country that shares a long border with Iran, that has a significant Shia population, that has historically tried to maintain carefully calibrated neutrality between Riyadh and Tehran, stood up in front of the world and put its credibility on the line for Saudi Arabia. That's not nothing. That's actually enormous. The Iranian response was fascinating. Foreign Minister Araghchi did not dismiss it, did not laugh it off. He asked for guarantees. Specifically, he wanted assurances that Saudi soil would not be used to launch attacks against Iran. Iran took the SMDA seriously enough to calibrate its strikes and to send its ambassador to Saudi Arabia with a public statement appreciating Riyadh's pledge not to allow its territory to be used against the Islamic Republic. That right there tells you everything. When Iran starts asking for guarantees, instead of simply ignoring you, it means your deterrence has weight. Pakistan's entry into this equation changed the Iranian calculation. Iran was not afraid of Pakistani tanks. Iran was afraid of something else entirely, something sitting in hardened bunkers in the Pakistani highlands that nobody wants to talk about directly, but that everyone in every intelligence agency on the planet is thinking about constantly. A Saudi official, when asked about the scope of the pact, told Reuters, "This is a comprehensive defensive agreement that encompasses all military means." Pakistan's own defense minister, Khawaja Mohammad Asif, appeared to confirm the nuclear dimension, saying Pakistan's capabilities will be made available to Saudi Arabia according to this agreement, before walking the statement back entirely to Reuters the following day. Now, I've been in the intelligence world. I know how these things work. When a defense minister makes a statement of that magnitude and then walks it back within 24 hours, what you're witnessing is not confusion. What you're witnessing is a carefully constructed ambiguity that is designed to do exactly what ambiguity is supposed to do in strategic deterrence: keep your adversary guessing. As Joshua White of the Brookings Institution told the Financial Times, you can't have deterrence without some constructive ambiguity. Pakistan said what it needed to say, Tehran heard what it needed to hear, and then Islamabad retreated to the safe harbor of plausible deniability. Then came March 7, 2026. Field Marshal Asim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, flew to Riyadh. Saudi Arabia had just formally, officially, publicly invoked the SMDA. That flight to Riyadh was not a courtesy call. That was a military commander receiving his operational orders, and what happened next confirmed it. A Pakistani military contingent of about 13,000 troops and 10 to 18 jets reached Saudi Arabia under the Joint Strategic Defense Pact on April 11, 2026. According to Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense, the deployment to King Abdulaziz Air Base in the eastern province includes Pakistan Air Force fighter jets as well as support aircraft, 13,000 troops. Let that number land. That is not a token force. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a combat-ready deployment of significant scale, placed deliberately in the most strategically sensitive piece of real estate in the world. Now, let me explain why that location matters so profoundly, because this is the part most analysts are glossing over. The base where Pakistani troops now sleep sits 7 kilometers from Aramco's headquarters, 40 kilometers from the Ras Tanura oil terminal that Iran struck on March 2nd, and 60 kilometers from the Abqaiq processing facility, all of which have been inside Iran's demonstrated missile strike envelope. You put Pakistani troops at that location, and you are telling Tehran something very specific. You are telling them that any missile aimed at the arteries of the global oil economy now has to pass through a Pakistani defensive posture. You are raising the cost of escalation in a way that Iranian military planners cannot simply dismiss. And what makes this even more complex, even more revealing about the world we now live in, is the financial dimension that ran directly parallel to the military one. The same day the troops landed, Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan visited Islamabad. Al-Jadaan confirmed $5 billion in Saudi Qatari financial support for Pakistan to be dispersed before June 2026, covering $4.8 billion in external obligations that Pakistan cannot meet on its own. The deployment announcement, the finance minister's visit, and the collapsing ceasefire talks all occupied the same 24-hour window. One analysis put it bluntly, and I think correctly. Saudi Arabia and Qatar didn't just request Pakistan's military, they purchased it. Not in some crude transactional sense, but in the very real sense that Pakistan's economic survival was structurally tied to Riyadh's goodwill, and that goodwill was now being called in. Pakistan imports 85% of its crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. As of early March 2026, Pakistan had approximately 28 days of fuel reserves remaining. 2 crude tankers bound for Pakistan were stranded in the strait, unable to move. So, when you ask why Pakistan did this, one layer of the answer is simply survival. Pakistan cannot function without Saudi financial support. Pakistan cannot fuel its economy if the strait stays closed. Pakistan cannot service its external debt without the rollover that only Riyadh can provide. This deployment was not purely altruistic brotherhood between Muslim nations, though that framing is useful for domestic audiences in both countries. This was a nation operating under profound economic duress, making the only calculation available to it: But here's where it gets constitutionally interesting. And this is the part that should concern anyone who cares about democratic governance. In April 2015, Pakistan's parliament voted unanimously to reject Saudi Arabia's request for troops, jets, and warships for the Yemen intervention, a rare bipartisan assertion of civilian authority over military deployments that embarrassed Riyadh. The 2026 deployment to the Eastern Province happened without a parliamentary vote, without a parliamentary debate, and without the constitutional mechanism that produced the 2015 rejection being triggered at all. The instrument that made this possible is the 27th Constitutional Amendment, passed on November 13, 2025, which created the post of Chief of Defense Forces, held concurrently by Army Chief Munir, who now commands all three services, controls the Strategic Plans Division responsible for Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, holds a 5-year tenure extending to 2030, and has lifelong immunity from prosecution. Think about what that means in plain English. 11 years ago, Pakistan's elected parliament looked at a Saudi request for military support and said no. In 2026, a single man, one general, sent 13,000 troops and nearly 24 fighter jets to a foreign country's most sensitive military installation without asking a single elected representative for permission. That is a fundamental transformation in how Pakistan is governed, and the implications of that transformation extend far beyond this deployment. When one man controls the nuclear codes, commands all three military branches, cannot be prosecuted, and serves for 5 years regardless of who wins elections, you are no longer dealing with a parliamentary democracy. You are dealing with something else entirely, something that Washington quietly prefers because generals are more predictable than parliaments. And then there is the India dimension, which nobody in the mainstream American media is adequately addressing. Geopolitical analyst Ian Bremmer suggested that the pact could alter India's security calculus, particularly if Saudi Arabia is committed to coming to Pakistan's defense in the event of a conflict. India has watched all of this with deep alarm. India reacted with statements that it is carefully monitoring the development. Analysts noted the timing of the pact appeared to be a warning after Israel's expanding military offensive across the Middle East. New Delhi understands what most Western analysts are choosing not to state plainly. Pakistan just secured a Gulf state ally with deep pockets and now operates under a mutual defense framework that, on paper, obligates Saudi Arabia to come to Pakistan's aid if India attacks. That changes the strategic math on the subcontinent. It changes India's risk assessment. It changes the potential costs of any military adventurism toward Pakistan. And it means that the next India-Pakistan crisis will not just be a bilateral affair. It will have Riyadh watching with an activated treaty and a checkbook. Now let's talk about what America's role in all of this actually is, because this is where the story gets truly uncomfortable for anyone who has been telling themselves that U.S. dominance in the Gulf is secure. The United States' 7-decade dominance as the ultimate guarantor of Gulf security is being visibly tested, visibly found wanting, and visibly supplemented by a new set of arrangements that involve nuclear-armed Pakistan, a newly assertive Saudi Arabia, and a China that is watching all of it carefully from the sidelines. China, together with Pakistan, published a 5-point plan on the Iran conflict on March 31st, 2026, including calls for respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity and restoring normal passage through the strait as soon as possible. Beijing is not a bystander in this moment. Beijing is positioning itself as the alternative order builder, the one that will offer stability without the conditions and contradictions that Washington keeps generating. The perception that Riyadh can tap into Pakistan's nuclear arsenal sends several troubling signals. That nuclear umbrellas are becoming a tradable security service rather than an exceptional arrangement, that some states can rely on others' nuclear weapons while still claiming to be non-nuclear under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that nuclear threats are being further woven into regional crises, increasing the risk of miscalculation and escalation for millions of people in the Middle East and South Asia. That is not alarmism, that is a clinical assessment of where the nuclear order is heading. And it is heading there because the old order, the one built on American guarantees, NATO cohesion, and the NPT framework, is visibly fraying. MBS didn't create that problem. He is responding to it. Pakistan didn't create that problem. It is navigating it under extreme economic and strategic pressure. Pakistan finds itself in a precarious situation, conflict on the western border, insurgencies in Balochistan, and also trying to mediate a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran to desperately avoid going to war for the kingdom, but having to keep its obligations for diplomatic and economic ties, further putting strain on a country already stretched to its limits. This is the tragic irony of Pakistan's position. On the same day its troops landed at King Abdulaziz Air Base, Pakistan was hosting ceasefire negotiations between Washington and Tehran. Islamabad was simultaneously trying to be the neutral peacemaker and the active military ally. It cannot be both indefinitely. Eventually, that contradiction resolves itself, and how it resolves will define Pakistan's trajectory for a generation. The real story behind the Pakistan nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia is not whether Islamabad will push a button, but whether the shadow of that button is enough to hold the Middle East together while it tears itself apart. The answers to those tests will shape the Middle East, South Asia, and global security for decades to come. That's the question you should be sitting with right now. Not whether Pakistan is a good ally or a bad actor, not whether MBS deserves protection. The real question is this: when the old security architecture collapses, when the American guarantee loses its credibility, when allies start shopping for alternative umbrellas, where does it end? Because the logic that drove MBS to call Islamabad instead of Washington is the same logic that is quietly spreading to other capitals, the same logic that is reshaping every alliance, every treaty, every security arrangement on the planet. The world is not becoming more dangerous because bad people are doing bad things. The world is becoming more dangerous because the rules, institutions, and guarantees that kept a lid on it are dissolving in real time, and everyone with power is scrambling to build their own alternative before the next crisis arrives. Pakistan just put 13,000 troops in the most volatile corner of the globe. That is not a story about two countries. That is a story about the end of one world order and the violent, chaotic birth of whatever comes next.